So this is something I recently learned about called the vulnerability loop, and it really circles back to why survivors of narcissistic relationships struggle with trust. When you vulnerably ask a narcissistic person for help, or it's clear that you needed help because you were struggling, what happened in your narcissistic relationship? We can turn this into a multiple choice question. Because what happened is that they either A, helped you, B, looked at you as you struggled and walked away, C, told you that you were dumb if you couldn't do it, D, helped you and told you that you were incompetent or foolish or otherwise lacking because you couldn't do it yourself. Well, we know answer A is not the right answer, but answers B, C, and D are all equally likely. So this is a problem, and it may speak to the larger issue of people in narcissistic relationships struggling with trust, something that comes up all the time for survivors of narcissistic relationships. I was reading my friend John Levy's book recently, and he talked about the research of someone named Jeffrey Polzer, who talks about something called the vulnerability loop, which sort of goes like this. First, you show some kind of vulnerability and either ask for help or someone watching you can see that you could use some help. Then the other person acknowledges your ask, and in the best version of this process, that other person responds to that vulnerability you showed and they help you. In another version of this, they look at you and do nothing or reject your vulnerable need for help. If they do the first thing, they acknowledge and offer to help you, that establishes trust. If they reject the ask or your show of vulnerability, you will become less likely to show that vulnerability or ask for help in the future. The loop gets closed when our vulnerable show or ask for help is met by the other person. Not only are we more likely to ask for help in the future when this happens, we are also drawn closer to the helper. What is challenging is that in this model, the ask for help comes before the trust, meaning that the trust gets established by that other person acknowledging your vulnerable ask for help. And Polzer goes on to say that in order to grow and even establish a meaningful and close relationship, we have to be willing to signal that kind of vulnerability, that ask, that show, that need for help. Well, that's going to be tough, if not impossible, for survivors of narcissistic relationships. These authors suggest that if you don't signal vulnerability and make your need for help known, and instead attempt to be perfectionistic, you will become isolated from other people and keep people at a distance because it requires the willingness to signal vulnerability to get close. And that means that survivors of narcissistic relationships are kind of stuck. Some of this comes down to when the narcissistic cycles began in your life. But let's just, for the sake of argument, start with adulthood. You meet someone, and you have that moment, which happens in all lives, that you're not able to do something, or you're struggling, and you let that be known. Can you help me? And the narcissistic person either doesn't respond, or responds in a manner that is shaming. This vulnerability loop then was not closed. And not only is vulnerability not only disincentivized, it's not rewarded, meaning that you don't feel that you can be vulnerable with this person, trust is also not being cultivated, and connection is not being cultivated. Over time, as this happens in this relationship, you're going to try to be more self-sufficient, more perfect, and certainly not be vulnerable. But all of this doesn't come without a toll. Not being vulnerable doesn't mean you are strong. It can actually be a prelude to despair, because then the opportunity to build strong, trusting connections with people is gone. Listen, you may make attempts to get help, and people may help, but when it is shaming and unempathic, that doesn't foster vulnerability. It fosters the idea that relationships are risky places, and being vulnerable results in more shame. It's a bad cycle. One of the greatest struggles for survivors of narcissistic relationships is isolation and loneliness. And this is compounded by the loss of trust in the world. But when you think of it through the perspective of this vulnerability loop, it makes more sense. Not only does this loop not close in the narcissistic relationship, which means vulnerability feels like an unsafe play and trust isn't fostered, connection is also not fostered. And this can become a trickle down where we start to believe that being vulnerable anywhere or with anyone is tricky business. And certainly nobody is going to help us out. And the risk of the vulnerability simply feels like it's not worth it. Many people who endure narcissistic relationships believe that they need to do everything, do all of it themselves. Nobody can, and that makes us inefficient. But it makes sense, doesn't it, right? The more narcissistic people you have or have had in your environment, especially if the narcissistic person is a primary player in your life, the less likely you will ever be helped. And if you are, then it comes with too high an opportunity cost. I recently witnessed this dynamic, a person who was genuinely vulnerable for medical reasons and a narcissistic person. It was unmistakable how vulnerable the vulnerable person was. And the narcissistic person had sort of an eye-rolling stance towards the vulnerable person. The vulnerable person was so bad at asking for help to their own detriment, but really, why would they? And they still doubted themselves. We are living in a so-called epidemic of loneliness. And I agree with this. All this digital pseudo-connection creates a false diet of connection. It's like artificial sweetener instead of the real thing. However, it's something more. Because people in narcissistic relationships often do have people around them. But these vulnerability loops never get closed, and trust and connection and the value of vulnerability are not fostered. And this back and forth of having our vulnerability seen and it being mocked or ignored can negatively impact our capacity to make connections, even when the narcissistic relationship is over. The work I have read about these vulnerability loops was largely referring to adult relationships. But if a person had a narcissistic parent, the same thing happens. Children are vulnerable by definition, but that vulnerability is inevitably mocked, raged at, or ignored by a narcissistic parent. Theoretically, then, that loop doesn't get closed. Vulnerability is not safe, connections are not fostered, attachment is not fostered, and you know the rest of that story. Lots of what is written about narcissism relates to vulnerability, that their thwarted vulnerability and their need to have grandiose defenses to protect their vulnerability means that they are basically a cauldron of shame that lashes out at anything or anyone that triggers that vulnerability. Because then they feel shame that pretty quickly converts into rage. And one could argue that your vulnerability is something they can't tolerate, so they bounce it back at you. They bounce it back at you with shame. Vulnerability is dangerous territory in a narcissistic relationship on both sides. But the lack of these closed loops can make healing difficult. So taking Levy and Polzer's hypothesis further, we have to find places to close these loops. These would be people who actually do see our vulnerability and help. because Lord knows most survivors do not feel safe asking for that help. But the idea that someone could see that we are struggling and face us and assist us with warmth and kindness can be a revelation for a person who has been through a narcissistic relationship. And when that happens, and especially if it happens more than once, that loop gets closed. Now, this is going to take longer with a survivor of narcissistic relationships, because if you still have contact with a narcissistic person, you still get the message that vulnerability is dangerous. But it can happen, and discernment means that we learn who we can be vulnerable with and with whom it's not possible. It's a tougher way to live, but it is possible. The hard thing is that when folks write about the vulnerability loop, they are often extolling its virtues. I have to say, when I read it, I felt some grief. And I could hear the voices of survivors who feel that there is nowhere to turn for help, that asking for help is riskier than doing it yourself, that trust is hard to come by or will be betrayed, and that vulnerability is akin to masochism. Healing is pushing back on all of that so you can get the support you need, be validated, and come back into yourself. But it takes time, and most of us who are survivors have a lot of unclosed vulnerability loops, as well as the exhaustion of doing it all ourselves to contend with. Thanks again.